published on June 26, 2013. It was live June 25th, 2013. Today's September 25th, 2017. A little bit over 4 years.
Those changes to the authorization.
Okay, very good. Let me turn to the ranking member, Senator Paul, and then Senator Keyes. I'll turn to you right after that. Senator Paul, I apologize. We started right. I know you were on your way, and I just wanted to keep the meeting going. I apologize that you were not here.
No, that's great. That's a first in Senate history to be on time. I want to thank the panel members for coming today. I was wondering, Mr. Manning, are FEMA preparedness grants being used to purchase drones?
Senator, no. There have been some grantees that have purchased remote-controlled low-level aircraft, basically RV, like what you would think of as like a hobby aircraft that have cameras for monitoring.
Drones can be of different expenses. It sounds like a drone to me, just a cheaper one. And do you have a policy then for surveillance? If you're giving out money that's being used to be purchasing surveillance, do you have a policy in place for how the money is spent, how the surveillance is done?
The department does have policies in place with our grantees and with the various fusion centers on protection of civil rights and civil liberties through our Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties and the Intelligence and Analysis Directorate.
So what is the policy then for using drone surveillance?
Senator, I'd have to defer to my colleagues across the department for specifics on those answers, but I know that they work to ensure that they're compliant with all of the Department of Justice regulations.
Does anybody on the panel know anything about the drone surveillance program or any of the drone money being used for drones? David, did you have a comment?
We haven't done any work specifically looking at use of FEMA grants for purchasing of drones. We've done broader work on drones, but not specific to FEMA grants.
You know, see, the problem is that, you know, your fusion centers haven't always been the best at defending civil liberties. There have been instances where the fusion centers have targeted people for their political beliefs. We're in the midst of a...
Pause it right here. Now, then when he says targeted for their political beliefs, this is for the 99%. Anybody does not agree to the New World Order, does not agree to be controlled and ran by a dictator. And if you don't conform to what they want, they're going to stick your ass right in them FEMA camps, or they're going to take you out.
Huge, you know, crisis in the country with the IRS apparently being used for political purposes. But a few years back, you know, the Missouri Fusion Center was targeting people for their political beliefs, third-party candidates, pro-life people, people with different bumper stickers on their car were said to be targeted by the fusion centers. There is a big concern that allowing your money, our money, to be used to purchase drones without any rules in place or without an awareness of what the rules are is disconcerting. There are some who believe that once you get outside your house, you have no privacy. I tend to disagree, and I think these are things we're going to have to revisit. But we now have the FBI director saying that drones are being used. He wasn't aware or forthcoming with any specific policy on privacy. So these are not something of passing concern. I'm also concerned about, you know, where these grants are going. Apparently some grants are being used to pay office rent. Some grants are giving to a fusion center that had a 0% progress towards its goals. David, Mara, would you have any comment on exactly how we would go about trying to have better oversight?
Absolutely. Last year we issued a report looking at that aspect of FEMA grant programs. We looked at the 4 largest programs and identified the amount of visibility that FEMA had over the specific uses of the funds, and we found that for some of the largest programs, FEMA may not know specifically how the funds are being used at the time they make decisions to provide the money. That creates a problem. It also, in our mind, raises the potential risk of unnecessary duplication. In other words, grantees could potentially receive funds from more than one program for the same or similar activities without the internal workings of FEMA being aware that that was happening. Now, we looked into that. We looked at 1,000 different grant awards. We didn't find any examples of specific duplication, but there were a couple hundred cases where if you just looked at the data they had in their systems, FEMA systems, it looked like on paper they were being funding for the same things from different programs.
Well, Senator Begich, I think this is a good example of really where, the bill that you and I have talked about of trying to pay people to save money, give people within the bureaucracy of government more pay to save money would be a good example because, I mean, one is just so enormous and nobody has the proper incentives. If it were my money, I'd be watching it, but since it's not my money, I don't really care. That seems to be the attitude of most people in government. We had the trailers that sat in Arkansas for years and years. We had the ice that was stored by the hundreds of thousands of pounds for Katrina that never got there. We had the inmates in Baton Rouge who were, receiving displaced money from FEMA. We had people staying in resorts. We had all kinds of things, but it's not really because there's one particularly bad person or one particularly bad policy. It's really because there is no incentive for anybody to protect the money because it's just not theirs. And I think the enormity of how much money will always lead to abuse. I think the distance from the problem, being in Washington, really most of this stuff ought to be locally collected and locally handled. And it's really why, when certain states want $62 billion, they want it all at once. They don't, they can't stand to get it a little bit at a time, so there could be more surveillance or more oversight of whether the money's being spent properly. It's really why things ought to be done differently. And instead of giving $62 billion, after Sandy in one bulk sum, I feel certain that we'll be back here in 5 years talking about, how that money was abused as well. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Let me go to Senator Chiesa, but let me also, Mr. Manning, if I could ask that you could ask the department to submit to the committee whatever written policies or documentations and utilization of drones or whatever the right term is for protection of civil liberties and how that is done. If you could have that, whoever the right person is there to submit that, I think we'd all be very interested in what written policies there are on that. Let me turn to Senator, again, Chiesa. Thank you.